So where did all this start? So Eric Posner and Glenn came up with this book called Radical Markets, and they provided a radically different outlook on how the societal framework is. And some of the key ideas were property is a monopoly, radical democracy, uniting the world's workers, dismembering the octopus, and data as labor. If you want to know more about these ideas, you can go to radicalmarkets.com, where the book is also available. And the whole idea was to reimagine the framework of marketplaces to better serve the common good. From that starting point, it evolved into the first RadicalxChange conference this year, which brought in the Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin, many others who were also grappling with similar social issues in their respective fields. So the idea was to learn from each other and grow. And incidentally, Joe was also a panelist at this conference, and he presented implementing quadratic voting in places. The next step then was for people, the ideas that were exchanged in that conference, to take that to the grassroots level. So ours is a small attempt in doing just that. But this is the Portland chapter. Different cities have started the similar chapters, say in New York, Seattle, Chicago, and it's very organic. Anyone can join and bring their ideas as to what is near and dear to them to affect the change. What we are focusing on right now are the first two, that's property is monopoly and radical democracy, and we look at it as a top-down and bottom-up framework, and we are looking forward for public participation in being involved with the other three, so that together we can present an action plan for next year's conference and how that could affect our city or the world at large. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Joe for his presentation.
So definitely thank you for coming on time. And so we want to explore ways of traveling in and around Portland. So my name is Joe Lambke, and as an architect, my primary focus is on the physical aspects of living. However, past research and experience have taught me that organization, those intangible operational practices, are what make significant contributions to building great things. So great buildings emerge from great clients, and great cities emerge from great governance. So a quick background sketch on Animate. We've worked with some great organizations. We built some great projects for them, including the Commission to Design a Theory in Computing Sciences building. And I did some research with the Santa Fe Institute, an agent-based simulation of dudes running around, interacting, making deals, adding value to the landscape, which then evolves into multi-scale places. So with that was fun. But let's talk about traveling around Portland. So the term transportation is so broad, sometimes it might be easier to say what we won't discuss, like rockets and zip lines, but places and lifestyles are so thoroughly integrated that, who knows, we might touch on those ideas. But, and I also want to start with a stated assumption, which is that any solution needs to be sustainable, green, and energy-wise. infiniteTransit is an urban rail and pedestrian travel solution that uses the most efficient, energy-efficient modes of urban travel. So therefore, since we're kind of already there, we could focus on other challenges and really talk about the dynamics of urban form. So with the summary, we want to build places where people live in the future, and we want to make those places as productive and civilized as possible. So with that guiding our efforts, we can work through how can we build amenity-saturated places suitable for pedestrians, how can we make travel, the processes of living, less stressful around the entire metropolis? And how can we organize and fund the construction to benefit the common good? We have a few more things to cover before we jump into 130 mile an hour travel inside a metropolis. So let's review human places, processes, and context that becomes us. So starting with the notion of place, what is a place? A place is where people come together and interact. Might be a city, a town, a farmer's market, a food truck park, this event, or a stock exchange. And people and cultures across history have always valued these places at any scale that are defined by a permeable boundary and an active center. And a permeable boundary is kind of similar to personal space. A permeable boundary is where one place relates to other places, and this boundary occurs where urban life relates to the ecological environment within which we live. So farmers markets are one indicator of this intangible attraction between the active urban center and the ecological open space beyond. And more so, the fuzzy boundary space is where invention happens. By contrast, if we have hard walls in any civilization, we're always attempts to resist evolution. So moving between the ecological open space and the active center represents the desire and the opportunity to learn. So fresh ideas are emergent in these permeable boundary spaces. And so looking at Portland, while each of us travels in our daily routine, we can imagine a variety of other people who have different needs to travel daily, like including kids and the elderly. We can't all ride scooters. So north is this direction in here. I don't know if you can see everything, but if you have Hillsborough out here and Gresham up there, that gives you kind of the extent of it. But it's always helpful to stand back and look at the big picture, and then we can see that each of these places have active centers and permeable boundaries. And when we think about the active center, what is an active center? It's the most frequently used space. Inside active centers, repetitive interactions create over time the structures, regulations, and organization of widely varied social interactions. So this is how cooperation emerges. Interactions add value to the place, and this becomes a civilization. Simultaneously, the ability to come and go, the sense of freedom to participate or not, via the openness of transportation is essential. And it is also a means of communication. So places are dynamic. Operationally, they're multi-scale and networked. So when we put them together, we find patterns of nested, mixed-use places at distinct levels of activity. And this corresponds to people's interests, expectations, and responsibilities, which are multi-scale and related to place. This is a bit of a non sequitur, but with the rise of industrialization, we created these huge megacities, and city planners began to observe power laws in the distribution of the size of places on the landscape across all civilizations. And this eventually led to the realization that all places are mixed use of any size. But when you look at cities as a complex adaptive system, it brings to life the fractal, nested structure of self-similar patterns in an evolving urban form. So I want to actually pass these out. So pass a few of these out here. So now I want to talk about travel, good governance, and said otherwise, the processes of organization. So the handout, and one of the things we've learned is the importance of acknowledging the levels of organization. Collective intelligence research abounds about the relationship between group sizes and quality decision making. These 7 levels of organization naturally correspond to governance, populations, speed of travel, and the physical construction of a place. And when we think about governance, maybe my Chicago upbringing, but I learned that gerrymandering district corrupts these levels, these natural levels of organization. So in examples of good governance, we find these levels are used to distribute responsibility, resources, and importantly, to obtain useful feedback and direct that feedback to the relevant decision-making process. And I know this level is a bit abstract, so I'd like to touch on the naturalness of it. Where does these levels come from? So, like any good pattern recognition machine, you might be wondering where they came from. In one example, it turns out that horses happen to prefer certain speeds of travel, which correspond to their oxygen consumption. So over millenniums, human beings recognized the pattern that they were moving in. We developed terminology to refer to each distinct speed. We call it walking, trotting, and galloping. But what's really cool is that the horse's most preferred speed is related to optimal energy consumption. So that's one clue relating levels of organization to transportation. So when building places, transportation is a kind of a stand-in for physical flow. And architects coordinate the flow of people at different levels into space. And then this gives character to the space. And people turn the spaces into places. This chart illustrates how we found these levels. It clarifies that in all of history until 1900, there were only 3 levels of transportation. Walking, riding an animal, and then the invention of the steam engine, which at that time was going slightly faster than 30 miles an hour. I mean, usable steam trains were really slow. So coordination at that point appeared relatively straightforward, and we ended up with United States representative democracy. However, since then, suddenly, very suddenly, on an evolutionary timescale, there are now 7 levels of transportation, the ones you're looking at. And for the last 120 years, human beings have struggled to understand the patterns of interactions that these new transportation and communication technologies create. I mean, we have these too. So as a growing city, Portland desperately needs to coordinate its transportation. So we can begin to look at that. When we look at Portland, we can see that on a typical day in Portland, there are only 3 levels of transit. 1, 2, and 3, walking, cycling, and cars or TriMet, all of which are slow relative to the kind of global economic environment that we're operating in. So at 3 a.m. or on an extended holiday, people can drive the highways at 70 miles an hour. But basically, most roads at TriMet are averaging 40. So looking at 2 other examples, this shows Shanghai here, Portland here, and this is Florence, Italy here. And they're about approximately at the same scale. And what's really fun about it is that Shanghai and Florence have approximately double the density of Portland. Actually more than double the density of Portland. But the way they reduce stress, like Shanghai reduces stress because they have a phenomenal subway system. They have 16 lines on their subway. They have a maglev line to the airport, to one of their airports. They have 2 huge airports. They have 3 high-speed train stations. So they have this robust system that reduces the stress in daily life for people to get around and take care of their business. Florence, by contrast, increases density with fewer modes of travel and has no trees. I mean, if you look at this diagram out here, you can barely tell, but it's mostly red because it's clay tile roofs. There's no trees, it's all clay tile roofs, and it's 3-story buildings continuous throughout. And their density is limited to less than about approximately a square mile or so. So the density is very high, but they only had 2 modes of transportation. So in Portland, we have to think about what do we want to do. I mean, do we want to exist like Florence? We need a lot better art. Or we can add some, upgrade our transportation system and coordinate it to reduce the level of stress. So So we are looking to create a travel strategy, kind of how we process things in Portland, tailored to Portland's future, where we can keep some trees, hopefully. So stress when traveling is caused by using a vehicle that's either too slow or too fast to suit the needs of the travel that we have. So planes are excellent if we need to travel 400 miles an hour, but they might be a little fast to get across Portland. And skateboards are also nice, but they're probably not a stress-free mode of transit if you're going 60 miles an hour. So we want to coordinate the mode with what we need to reduce stress, actually, is what it all comes down to. So that's our challenge. And let's look at the context. What would happen if we did use 7 levels to govern and create space? So Animate created the Kid Cities mechanism to evolve and increase the spatial contrast. So the mechanism forms distinct places from the actions people take in a place. Without going into too much detail, I just want to touch on why increased spatial contrast matters. So we worked on a project in Muzhang, and we found out that visibility becomes essential. Visibility helps people to associate governance issues with a place, or even just if you need something, you know where to go get it. So it helps you manage navigating your place. Visibility coordinates the scale of an issue with the appropriate inclusion of people, resulting in more accurate collective decision making. It also eliminates fatigue from too many issues overwhelming voters with details and relevance. So for example, if you have a large issue, you go to the place where the tallest buildings are and there's enough amenities that you know you can get your issue resolved. If you're going for daily things, you might just go out to this very small place out here and it has a different environment. And we want to be able to navigate through this network of places. So to update the effectiveness of U.S. representative democracy, we could think like biological engineers. We work to change operational processes which will construct an intended physical result. So implementing infinite transit increases the visibility of places, and yet there's more. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. I have to turn that off. So an increased spatial contrast. This is a fun diagram. Different physical landscapes reflect different governance organizations. Some are limited by outsiders, some are limited by in-group social norms, and others are prone to catastrophic collapse. So we're suggesting that a highly correlated, multi-scale fitness landscape provides a visible opportunity for people to understand the ecological and usable context of their interests. And it reflects a higher organizational effectiveness and is more robust to global economic activity. So technically speaking, we might say this is like Houston, where they don't have any zoning whatsoever, and a big corporation can come in and build whatever they want next to anybody else. It doesn't matter. I kind of think this is a little bit like Chicago because it has a single-peaked fitness landscape, which had a kind of value to it. And I think this is a solution that is robust to economic activity. It's certainly pedestrian-oriented, but it maintains small-scale places as opposed to kind of a relentless monotony of fitting in. So those are some of the varieties of that. Quickly, sustainability again. It is the context that we operate within which ultimately governs how much energy we use. So energy usage is both individual and collective. A stressful context taxes our mental faculties to navigate a place. If a place has complicated routes and modes of transit, individually we spend a lot of mental energy transitioning from one task task to the next. So we want to reduce that stress level again, as well as the physical energy level. So when we look at the physical energy level, there's all kinds of engineering graphs out there, but this one's kind of simple. It's like high energy cost and high speed. And obviously this is high energy, low speed, and this is high speed, low energy. So this is where we want to be. It's a little utopian way out here. But infinite transit does bring us in this direction, and that's a positive thing. So that's the kind of physical aspect of energy. So when we look at the stress induced by complicated and slow travel, two simultaneous objectives jump out. Increase the density of possible interactions at each level and reduce the time used to get between these places. So that's kind of defines our goal. The context that reduces navigation costs mentally and physically will result with more energy available for innovation and civility. So the challenge are these two things. So that's why we came up with infinite transit. So looking at Portland, imagine a rail-based system with few yet highly concentrated places of interaction. Imagine with infrequent stops, one can travel at higher speeds, reducing the time between places. For example, we can reduce the time from Beaverton to PDX to 13 minutes. And that includes a very generous stopover time of 1 minute at a station. Many subway systems, the doors open and close for 10 seconds. So 1 minute would be a very graceful, generous time for people to get on and off and load their gear, as it were. What's also interesting is when you're going this fast, it changes the way we think about things. Most subways are dead ends. They go to a dead end spot. But because we have these generous distances, looping it makes more sense. So this kind of infinite symbol loop makes sense. And secondly, and then also it's so fast that even if you need to go from PDX back to Beaverton, you have to go most of the way around the city, it still only takes you 41 minutes, which is pretty decent. If there's traffic outside, it would definitely be faster. So even in its most minimal phase one, only a single track state, the system serves everybody quite well. And further, it integrates the communities. I mean, when was the last time anybody from Beaverton did anything in Gresham? So now we have a kind of true community integration, because instead of the dead-end subway lines, which basically segregate large metropolises, we're really unifying people together. A couple of other key things about it is that it would only take 6 trains to provide service every 10 minutes. So this kind of looping high-speed system changes the way we think of things. The other thing is we talk about everybody wants high-speed rail, but again, according to the levels, high-speed rail doesn't really fit in American life because America is such a large continent. But more importantly, we need to solve the metropolitan transportation solution so we can use a higher speed rail to solve the metropolitan transportation. And we don't need to use maglev technology or the Hyperloop. We can use standard off-the-shelf train systems that are available today. So there's no new technology, it's just we're using it in a new way. And then lastly, imagine that all these places in between here that in theory are not being served, they don't have to increase their density. In fact, it's valuable that there's all these small-scale places in between here. And we get to keep a lot of trees. So we think maintaining the low-scale value of these places is better than increasing it uniformly. And the key there is that while nothing needs to change from a zoning standpoint in here, what does happen is simply because you're relatively close to this kind of an integrated system, the economic environment that you're living in grows. So it grows the economic environment without changing any of the zoning and underlying low-value areas in between. So we think that's also quite valuable. Changes the context, simplifies the processes, and increases civility in the places where we live. So what might it look like? This is not infinite transit, either one. I've heard numerous times, though, that Portland transportation officials are considering a subway. That's not surprising, since many people find elevated tracks a disaster. But few acknowledge that subways were built as bomb shelters, and we gently recommend better diplomacy instead of bomb shelters. And for people, infinite transit is better than both of these. Frankly, both old-fashioned ideas. In civilized places, transportation can be a joy. There's no reason to build costly stations, since a train services people best at the level of the street. So infinite transit merges these two ideas, matching street-level service with high-speed travel. The way it does that is, it's accessed at the street level only for one block, where people get on and off, and then one block on either side when it continues above grade. So it only takes 3 blocks to provide a station of street-level access. And then this supports the continuation of normal street activities in these higher density places. Another key feature is that since the next stop is quite a distance away, the tracks can be high enough and small enough to exist unobtrusively in the urban fabric. So we think you can weave this through a city and it can be quite beautiful. Certainly better than riding a subway, I put it that way. And then once outside the core of urban places, infinite transit continues with no streetlights above quiet open spaces between urban places. So such a route then becomes a tourist attraction to view a metropolis growing into a way to learn about cities, all the different cities that make up a metropolis. This particular bridge is actually a highway, so it's super wide compared to what a 2-line rail system would be. But it was designed specifically to try to reflect a bunch of light down below and maintain pleasant spaces down below. So there's plenty of ways to do that. In a fuller implementation around Portland, additional lines and places would be connected, providing 2-way service on the essential routes. We can include Hillsborough, we can include Oregon City, we can include Vancouver. All of those things are possibilities in a more robust system. So how do we get there? I think Portland transportation people would look at me like I'm crazy because the cost is phenomenal. We can't even get $2 billion. How are we going to pay for this? We're envisioning a consortium that works with government agencies. It raises money, it builds the system, and it operates infinite transit. Places adding a station will change the zoning within 3/4 of a mile of the station to increase the density, to allow much greater density. Within that walkable distance to highly valued transportation, the incremental value is recovered to pay for some of the transportation system. So for example, the consortium might own 1 to 3 tall buildings at each station. And then other properties can evolve as the opportunities arise. So some of it is owned by the consortium, others are just developer projects. But beyond the walkable range, again, that lower value property remains. It still has a higher level of service, but there's no need to change much there. And it's uniform across the city. So these become more integrated with the socioeconomic opportunities across the metropolis. Similarly, infinite transit is a complementary means of travel to the existing system. So TriMet, the highways, those are fine, they need to be maintained, they can be upgraded, but infinite transit is complementary to them. It's not, it's additive, it's not going to replace any of the existing systems we do. And it becomes more integrated. So another thing about implementation implementation. So we're looking at Beaverton here. You can see St. John's and downtown Portland here. The way we envision it, how do you implement it down here in a single place? If we just take this area of Beaverton and look at that, infiniteTransit would give residents more than a community meeting to pick colors for the station. The implementation requests that citizens identify their priorities about which development suits their local community. So we envision 3 different possible station configurations and track configurations and development opportunities. And these 3 potential schemes would be presented to the community, and the community can vote on them, identifying which one they think is a higher priority to build, and then one of those is selected, and that's where they go. And in other communities, like say Lake Oswego, may not want to be connected at all. Some communities would simply opt out, and that's reasonable as well. So we are also working with some colleagues on the finances. It's really great to be able to say that it's funded by the private sector, which essentially it is, and that's super attractive. But what makes it work is the incentive structure. So the incentive structure is to make highly accessible, stress-free travel. That's all the financial incentives are geared towards that end. So this radically increases the property value near the stations, including the consortium-owned taller buildings, which is where the real profits are generated. It is possible to envision free travel, since the revenue to support the transit is generated from radically increasing the real estate value at the station. And you can only do that if you have really, really great service. So you need to provide excellent service to increase the real estate value. By contrast, public transportation attempts to generate profit from fares and additional taxes when the fares aren't enough. And this continuously erodes the quality of travel on a public transportation experience. With our colleagues, this consortium kind of sits in the middle, and we have to have government in the loop. So government's going to be a part of it. Yes, there's some private investors, but there's other entities that can also be a part of this. And so the consortium agreement is this kind of central repository, but it's as long as we can provide the right incentives, we can generate the right outcome. And we have to have government involved, and obviously there's some government money included as well. But ultimately, we could say this with great caution, but we could say no new taxes would be needed from properties outside of these walkable urban places. So we think that's pretty exciting. When we look at the vehicles, I mean, this is obviously very conceptual, so we're a little ahead of ourselves with the vehicles. But infiniteTransit Flyway is neither public nor private, and it's a new category of travel. So we can only begin to imagine what the design of vehicles people will be traveling in. But it's not just the vehicles. So in here, we kind of see 4 different flavors: living, playing, working, and learning. And what do we mean by those flavors? Well, when we travel for different reasons. And sometimes when you travel, you really just want a well-designed, quiet atmosphere with great service. And so in that situation, I pulled out this image, which is maybe not architecturally my style, but that's fine. But it exudes this feeling of calmness, of you're going to be able to take care of what you need, and you can envision people having meetings and so on and so forth, business meetings or whatever. But it's kind of it reduces your stress, actually. It's kind of the key. And so I can envision a car with these kind of characteristics. So that's kind of living with well-designed atmosphere, quiet, great service. Playing is another one. I mean, sometimes when we travel, we're all going to the ball game together, and we're a little more high energy. We're interacting with others, we're playing games. And in this particular image is from, it's the, what do you call it? Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. They have their international holidays in September, which is Speak Like a Pirate Day. And somebody decorated their car just for Speak Like a Pirate Day, you know, complete with cannons and a pirate flag. And so that kind of playing is very valuable in the community. I mean, that's what gets people talking. It's a good thing. So we want to accommodate that as well. Another great example of this is in the New York subway. There's groups of gymnasts that will put on a show in the subway car in between stops. You know, so as soon as the doors close, they walk up and down the aisle and they say, hey, we're going to do a show. Just stand back and we won't touch you. And they're jumping off the ceiling and everything, and then at the end they ask for donations. And so that kind of activity is a positive thing. We want to accommodate that. And then there's working, you know. People have to work, and we want to straightforward. We want to get to work in the morning. We're sleepy. It could be informative. There might be advertising and so forth. But we just got to get our stuff done. You know, it's like whatever the stuff is that we have to get done, we just want to get it done. So we want something that enables us to facilitate moving our stuff around in the city if we need to. And then learning is another one. This is kind of the kid car. It's like, how do we ship kids to field trips around the city in a very, very safe manner? But the learning car is also about understanding with a broad perspective. It could be learning about things going on in the city. It could be learning about a lot of things. And so we just picked this image to kind of say, learning is an expansive car, and somehow it's going to educate you about the society that we live in. So those are 4 kinds of travel experiences that we can envision on this. They might run at different frequencies, I mean, maybe on the weekends or whatever, but we can imagine these 4 different kinds of services. And it's not just the vehicles, like the term station doesn't seem accurate as like a gas station. But we think a pauseway, like I'll meet you at the Pearl District Pauseway, was more suited to Portland. We don't have a term yet for the vehicles, the cars, trains, coaches, we could call them modules or pods. But maybe you just call it a ride, like let's take the living ride, or the working ride, or the playing ride. I take the learning ride to school. So there's ways we can think about that. So clearly people travel for different reasons. And of course we should offer distinct experiences to support the reasons why we travel. And there is a purpose. This differentiation is about building local community interactions. It is about increasing the civility and the innovation of the community. I mean, the working car broadens your perspective about what services are available. The learning car increases your understanding of what civil behavior might be in the city. So to wrap things up and kind of in this broadening your viewpoint, this learning idea, let's look at what might it look like in different cities. So in Chicago, we looked at it in Chicago. Chicago is much bigger, 2.5 times, almost 3 times as big as Portland. It gets more complicated. North is here, the lake is here. But Chicago has a really interesting opportunity down here where the old steel mills used to be, because they have lakefront property that's just dying for development, but it's gargantuan in scale. So this is like a whole new city down here. The New South is a new city. It's a new level 4 city. And it can't be built without something like this, because it doesn't get you anywhere. If you live down here, and O'Hare is really here, so what's generating economic activity is too far away. But if you build an infinite transit and you connect it to New South, all of a sudden you can get to O'Hare in at most 25 minutes, which in Chicago is unheard of. So that's the other thing. Chicago is Chicago would probably connect over to Gary and definitely to Milwaukee. The system's it's pushing the limits of this infinite transit system, but connecting to Milwaukee is probably a smart idea. And then we looked at Seattle. Unique to Seattle is there's kind of a dual center, and on all of the schemes, infinite transit tries to reinforce and strengthen the urban core. So by adding multiple stations very close together, this becomes the most highly valued land anywhere in the metropolis. But Seattle is unique in the sense that it has 2 urban cores. So Bellevue also becomes a core. And part of the reason we can to do that is because it's elongated, anchored by Boeing and Everett up north and Tacoma down south. So Seattle has its unique traits as well. So that's it. Just to review the goals and the 3 challenges from the beginning. Infinite transit, implemented artfully, would build amenity-saturated places. It delivers a less stressful travel experience, and it creates a context for cooperation. So we think it has the potential to instigate change, creating a new culture with a new kind of civility. So thank you.